A new article, "Always with the People," appeared on the wall newspaper in the hall of the Physics Institute. This article said that the Soviet Union, under the leadership of the great Stalin, who was guiding the country through the tempest of war, attached immense significance to science, that the party and government honoured and respected scientists as nowhere else in the world, and that even during the current difficult times, the Soviet state was providing scientists with all the conditions necessary for normal, productive work. It went on to list the great tasks now facing the Institute: the new building work, the expansion of the old laboratories, the bringing together of theory and practice, and the importance of scientific research for the armaments industry. Mention was made of the patriotic élan that had seized the collective of scientists. The collective was determined to justify the concern and trust of the party and of Comrade Stalin himself, determined not to disappoint the hope with which the people looked on this glorious vanguard of the Soviet intelligentsia. The final part of the article was about the unfortunate fact that there were certain individuals in this healthy and fraternal collective who lacked a sense of responsibility to the people and the party. Individuals who were isolated from the great Soviet family. These individuals were opposed to the collective and considered their personal interests of greater importance than the tasks entrusted to them by the party. They tended to exaggerate their own scientific achievements, real or imaginary. Deliberately or not, some of these individuals became mouthpieces for alien, anti-Soviet views and attitudes. The ideas they spread were politically dangerous. These individuals often called for an objective attitude towards the idealist, reactionary, and obscurantist theories of foreign idealists. They even boasted of their links with these idealists, thus belittling the achievements of Soviet science and offending the patriotic pride of Russian scientists. Sometimes these individuals posed as defenders of a supposedly flouted justice, trying to win cheap popularity among the short-sighted, the gullible and the naive. In fact, they were sowing seeds of discord, seeds of a lack of faith in Russian science, of a lack of respect for its splendid past and great names. The article called on scientists to liquidate every sign of decadence, everything alien and hostile, everything that might hinder the fulfillment of the tasks with which during the great patriotic war they had been entrusted by the party and the people. The article ended, "Forward toward new peaks of science, following the splendid path lit by the searchlight of Marxist philosophy, the path we have been shown by the great party of Lenin and Stalin." No names were mentioned, but the article was obviously about Victor. It was Savostyanov who first told him about it. At that moment, Victor was with a group of colleagues putting the last touches to the new apparatus. Instead of going to read it immediately, he threw his arms round Nozdrin's shoulders and said, "Come what may, this giant will do its work." Nozdrin responded with a volley of curses. For a moment, Victor wasn't sure who they were aimed at. Towards the end of the afternoon, Sokolov came up to Victor. "Victor Pavlovitch, I admire you. You've been working all day as though nothing had happened. You're a real Socrates." "If a man is born blonde, his hair won't turn brown just because he's been abused on a wall newspaper," said Victor. He was by now so accustomed to his feeling of resentment towards Sokolov as to be almost unconscious of it. He no longer reproached him for his excessive caution. Sometimes he said to himself, "He does have many good qualities. And besides, we all have our failings." "Yes," said Sokolov, "but there are articles and articles. Anna Stepanovna felt quite ill after reading it. First she went to the first aid post and then she was sent home." "What on earth have they written?" thought Victor. He preferred not to ask Sokolov, and no one else mentioned it to him. He might just as well have had terminal cancer. That evening Victor was the last to leave the laboratory. Alexei Mikhailovich The old caretaker, now working as a cloakroom attendant, said, "That's how it is, Viktor Pavlovitch. There's no peace in this world for an honest man." Viktor put on his coat, went back up the stairs and stopped in front of the board. When he had read the article, he looked round in confusion. For a moment he thought he was going to be arrested then and there, but the hall was quiet and empty. He could feel quite tangibly the difference in weight between the fragile human body and the colossus of the state. He could feel the state's bright eyes gazing into his face. Any moment now the state would crash down on him. There would be a crack, a squeal, and he'd be gone. The street was full of people, but there seemed to be a strip of no man's land between them and Viktor. In the trolleybus, a man in a soldier's winter cap turned excitedly to his companion. "Have you heard the latest news?" "Stalingrad!" someone shouted from one of the front seats. "The enemy's been crushed!" A middle-aged woman stared at Viktor. She seemed to be reproaching him for his silence. Viktor thought about Sokolov almost tenderly now. Yes, we all of us have our failings. But no one ever sincerely believes his own failings to be equal to those of other people. Soon Viktor was thinking, yes, but his views depend on his success, on the love shown him by the state. Now the tide's turning, now it looks like victory. He won't utter a word of criticism, but I'm not like that. Whether the state's strong or weak, whether it beats me or caresses me, my convictions remain the same. When he got home, he'd tell Lyudmila all about the article. Yes, they really did have it in for him now. "So much for the Stalin Prize, Lyudotchka," he would say. "An article like that means you're going to be arrested." We share one destiny, he thought. She'd accompany me if I was invited to lecture at the Sorbonne, and she'll accompany me to a camp in Kolyma. "Well, you can't say you haven't brought it on yourself," Lyudmila would say. And he would reply coolly, "I don't need criticism. I've had enough of that at the Institute. I need understanding and affection." Nadia opened the door. She flung her arms round him and buried her face in his breast. "What's the matter? Let me take my coat off. I'm cold and wet." "Haven't you heard yet? Stalingrad! There's been a tremendous victory. The Germans have been surrounded. Come on, come on!" She helped him off with his coat, took him by the hand and dragged him down the corridor. "This way, Mamma's in Tolya's room." She opened the door. Lyudmila was sitting at Tolya's desk. Slowly she turned her head and gave Viktor a sad, solemn smile. He couldn't bring himself to talk about what had happened at the Institute. Instead, they all sat down at Tolya's desk. Lyudmila drew a diagram showing how the Germans had been encircled and explained her plan of operations to Nadia. That night, when Viktor was alone in his room, he thought, "Oh God, why don't I write a letter of repentance? That's what everyone else does in a situation like this." It was several days since the article had first appeared. Work in the laboratory was going on as usual. Sometimes Viktor sank into depression, and sometimes his spirits revived, and he paced animatedly up and down the laboratory, tapping out his favourite tunes on the windowsill and the metal pipes. He said jokingly that an epidemic of short-sightedness had broken out in the Institute. People he knew looked straight through him and passed by without so much as a word. Once on the street, Gurevich caught sight of Viktor in the distance. He looked thoughtful, crossed to the other side and started reading a notice. Viktor had seen all this. He and Gurevich then looked round at the same moment and their eyes met, and Gurevich waved at him, pretending to look pleased and surprised. All this was far from amusing. Svechin said hello when they met. He even made an effort to walk more slowly, but from the look on his face he might have been greeting the ambassador of a hostile power. Viktor kept count of who turned away, who just nodded, and who shook hands with him. As soon as he got home, he would ask his wife, "Has anyone rung?" And Lyudmila would nearly always answer, "Only Maria Ivanovna." Knowing what he usually asked next, she would add, "And there's still no letter from Madyarov." "Do you see," said Victor, "the people who used to ring up every day now only ring occasionally, and the people who used to ring occasionally have stopped altogether." He even thought he was being treated differently at home. On one occasion he was drinking tea and Nadia walked past without saying anything. "You might say hello," he called out. "Do you think I'm an inanimate object?" He looked quite pathetic. Instead of coming out with some harsh retort, Nadia said hurriedly, "Oh dear, Papa, I'm very sorry." That same day he asked, "Listen, Nadia, are you still seeing your great strategist?" She simply shrugged her shoulders. "I just wanted to warn you, please don't talk politics with him. All I need is to be criticised on that count too." Again, instead of replying sarcastically, Nadia said, "You don't need to worry, Papa." On his way to the institute in the morning, Victor tried to avoid meeting people. He'd look round to assess the situation, then walk either more quickly or more slowly. When he arrived, he'd make sure the corridor was empty and then rush down it as quickly as he could, his head bowed. If one of the doors opened, his heart almost stopped beating. As he reached the laboratory, he'd heave a sigh of relief, like a soldier regaining his trench under enemy fire. One day Savostyanov came into Victor's office and pleaded with him, "Victor Pavlovitch, I entreat you, we all of us entreat you, write a letter, say you repent. I can assure you that will help. Just think, you're throwing away everything, and at a time when an important, no, a truly great work lies before you, a time when all that is genuine in our science looks to you with hope. Write a letter. Admit your errors." "What errors? What do you want me to repent of?" "Oh, who cares? It's what everyone does. Writers, scientists, political leaders, even your beloved Shostakovich. He admits his errors, writes letters of repentance, and then returns to work. It's like water off a duck's back." "But what do you want me to repent of? And who to?" "The director, the central committee. It doesn't matter, as long as you repent. Something like this: I have committed errors and I admit my guilt. I am now conscious of this and I promise to mend my ways. That sort of thing. You know what's expected. It's bound to help. It always does." Savostyanov's bright, laughing eyes were for once quite serious. He even seemed to be a different colour. Thank you, my friend," said Victor. "I'm grateful to you for your concern." An hour later Sokolov said, "Victor Pavlovitch, there's going to be an open meeting of the Scientific Council next week. I think you should say something." "What about?" "I think you need to make some explanations. To be more precise, you must make a confession of error." Victor paced up and down the room. Suddenly he stopped by the window, his eyes on the door. "What if I write a letter, Pyotr Laventreevich? That would be easier than spitting at myself in public." "No, I think you need to make a speech. I spoke to Svetchin yesterday. He led me to understand that they..." Sokolov made a vague gesture in the direction of the cornice above the door. "They require a speech rather than a letter." Victor turned round to face Sokolov. "No, I'm not going to make a speech, and I'm not going to write a letter." In the patient voice of a psychiatrist talking to someone mentally ill, Sokolov said, "Victor Pavlovitch, for you to remain silent is the equivalent of suicide. There are political accusations hanging over your head." "You know what torments me most of all," said Victor. "Why does all this have to happen at a moment of victory, a moment of general rejoicing? Now, any son of a bitch can say that I openly attacked the foundations of Leninism at a time when I imagined the Soviet regime was about to collapse. So I attacked people when they were down." I have heard that opinion expressed." "No," said Victor, "to hell with it. I'm not going to repent." That night he locked himself in his room and began to write the letter. And suddenly, overwhelmed with shame, he tore it up and began writing the text of his speech to the Scientific Council. He then read it over thumped his elbow on the table and tore that up too. "Well, that's it," he said out loud. "If they want to arrest me, they can." He sat there for a while without moving, mulling over the import of this decision. Then he had the idea of writing a rough draft of the letter he would have sent if he had repented. There was nothing humiliating about that. No one would ever see it. No one. He was alone. The door was locked. Everyone in the house was asleep, and it was quiet outside. There was no traffic. No car horns. But an invisible force was crushing him. He could feel its weight, its hypnotic power. It was forcing him to think as it wanted, to write as it dictated. This force was inside him. It could dissolve his will and cause his heart to stop beating. It came between him and his family. It insinuated itself into his past, into his childhood memories. He began to feel that he really was untalented and boring, someone who wore out the people around him with dull chatter. Even his work seemed to have grown dull, to be covered with a layer of dust. The thought of it no longer filled him with light and joy. Only people who have never felt such a force themselves can be surprised that others submit to it. Those who have felt it, on the other hand, feel astonished that a man can rebel against it, even for a moment, with one sudden word of anger, one timid gesture of protest. It was for himself that Victor wrote this letter. He intended to hide it away and never show it to anyone. Deep down, though, he knew that it might come in useful. He'd hang on to it. Next morning, as he drank his tea, he kept looking at the clock. It was time to go to the laboratory. He felt a chilling sense of isolation. It was as though no one would ever come round to see him again. And it wasn't simply fear that stopped people from ringing him up. It was the fact that he was so dull, so boring and talentless. "I don't suppose anyone asked for me yesterday," he said to Ludmilla. Then he quoted the lines, "I'm alone at the window. I don't expect guests or friends." "Oh yes, I forgot to say, Chepitsin's back. He phoned and said he wants to see you." How could you forget to tell me that?" He began to tap out a solemn tune on the tabletop. Ludmilla went over to the window. Victor was walking unhurriedly down the road, tall, bent forward, giving his briefcase an occasional swing. She could tell he was thinking about his coming meeting with Chepitsin. In his imagination, they had already exchanged greetings and were now deep in conversation. She felt very sorry for Victor, very anxious about him, but she couldn't forget his faults, least of all his egotism. How could he declaim, "I'm alone at the window," and then go off to the laboratory, where he had real work to do, where he was surrounded by people? In the evening he'd go and see Chepitsin. He probably wouldn't be back before midnight. And would he give her a moment's thought? Would it occur to him that she'd be alone all day, and that she'd be standing by the window in an empty flat, that she was the one who wasn't expecting friends or guests? She went into the kitchen to do the washing up. She felt more depressed than ever. Maria Ivanovna wouldn't be phoning. She'd gone to see her elder sister in Shabalovka. How anxious she felt about Nadia. She still went out every evening, even though it had been forbidden, and of course she didn't say a word about it. As for Victor, he was wrapped up in his own troubles. He didn't have time to think of Nadia. Suddenly the bell rang. It must be the carpenter she'd spoken to yesterday. He was coming to repair the door of Tolya's room. Human company, how wonderful! Ludmilla opened the door. A woman in a grey fur hat was standing in the half-lit corridor, suitcase in hand. "Zhenya!" she cried. Her voice was so loud and so tragic that it took even her aback. She kissed her sister, flinging her arms around her shoulders and sobbing, "He's dead! He's dead! My Tolya's dead!" A thin stream of hot water dribbled into the bath. If you turned the tap any further, the water became cold. The bath was filling very slowly, but the two sisters felt as though they'd hardly had time to exchange a word. While Yevgenia was in the bath, Ludmilla kept coming to the door and asking, "Are you all right in there? Do you want me to keep to or come in and rub your back for you. Keep an eye on the gas. It might go out." A few minutes later, she'd be back, banging on the door and asking impatiently, "What's going on in there? Have you gone to sleep or something?" Yevgenia came out of the bathroom in her sister's toweling dressing gown. "You look like a witch," said Lyudmila. Yevgenia remembered how Sofya Osipovna had once called her a witch on the night of Novikov's visit to Stalingrad. "It's strange," she said. "After 2 days in a crowded train, I've at last had a bath. I feel as though I should be in ecstasy, and yet—" "What's brought you here so suddenly? Is something wrong?" "I'll tell you in a moment," said Yevgenia with a wave of her hand. Lyudmila told her sister about Victor's troubles and about Nadia's unexpected and amusing romance. She told her about their friends who no longer rang up and pretended not to recognize Victor on the street. Yevgenia, in turn, told Lyudmila about Spiridonov. He was now in Kubyshev, and he wouldn't be offered a new job until the commission had completed its report. Somehow he seemed both noble and pathetic. Vera and her son were in Leninsk. Spiridonov couldn't so much as mention his little grandson without crying. Yevgenia went on to tell how Jenny Jerikovna had been exiled, how Limonov had helped her to get a residence permit, and what a sweet old man Shagorodsky was. Her head was still full of tobacco smoke, conversations from the journey, and the rumble of wheels. It was strange to be looking into her sister's face, to feel the soft dressing gown against her newly washed body, to be in a room with a carpet and a piano. In every word the two sisters said, in all the sad, joyful, absurd, or touching events they related, they could sense the presence of friends and family who had died, but who would always be bound to them. Whatever they said about Victor evoked the shade of his mother, Anna Semyonovna. Dmitri and his wife, who had both died in camps, loomed behind any mention of their son Seryotsa. And Lyudmila herself was always accompanied by the steps of a shy young man with broad shoulders and full lips, but neither of them mentioned any of this out loud. "I haven't heard any news of Sofya Osipovna. She seems to have vanished into thin air," said Yevgenia. "The Levinton woman?" "Yes, of course." "I never did like her. Are you doing any drawing?" "I did in Stalingrad, but not since I moved to Kubyshev." "Victor took 2 of your pictures when we were evacuated. You should be flattered." "Oh, I am," said Yevgenia with a smile. "Well, Madam General, you haven't said a word about what matters most of all. Are you happy? Do you love him?" Fingering her dressing gown, Yevgenia replied, "Yes, I am happy. I'm fine. We love each other." She glanced quickly at Lyudmila. "Shall I tell you why I came to Moscow? Nikolai Grigorovich has been arrested. He's in the Lubyanka." "Good Lord, what on earth for? He's such 100% communist." "And what about our Dmitri, or your Abarchuk? He was a 200% communist." "But your Nikolai was so harsh. He was quite ruthless at the time of general collectivization. I remember asking what on earth was happening, and he just said, 'The kulaks can go to the devil for all I care.' He had a lot of influence on Victor." "Lyuda," said Yevgenia, a reproachful note in her voice, "you remember only the worst about people, and you always bring it up at the wrong moment." "Well, what do you expect of me? I've always been one call to call a spade a spade." "Fine," said Yevgenia, "but don't imagine that's always a virtue." She lowered her voice to a whisper. "Lyuda, I was summoned for interrogation." She took her sister's scarf and draped it over the telephone. "Apparently the mouthpieces can be bugged." "Yes, I've had to make a statement." "You and Nikolai were never officially married, were you?" "No, but what of it? They interrogated me as though I were his wife. Let me start from the beginning. I was sent a summons to appear at the office and to bring my passport. I went through hundreds of names: Dmitri, Ida, Abarchuk, everyone I knew who'd ever been arrested, but I can tell you, I didn't once think of Nikolai. I was told to come back at 5 o'clock. It was just an ordinary office with huge portraits of Stalin and Beria on the wall. The investigator was a very ordinary-looking young man, but he looked straight through me as if he knew everything and said, "Are you aware of the counter-revolutionary activities of Nikolai Grigorovich Krimov?" Several times I thought I'd never be allowed out of the building. Once, can you imagine it, he even hinted that I'd become involved with Novikov in order to elicit information from him and report it to Krimov. I felt quite paralysed. I said, "But Krimov's such a fanatical communist. Just to be in his company was like attending a party meeting." The investigator replied, "If I understand you correctly, you're implying that Novikov himself isn't a true Soviet citizen." I said, "You are strange. At the front, people are fighting the fascists, while you young man sit at the rear and sling mud at them." I thought I'd get a slap in the face, but he actually blushed and looked embarrassed. "So Nikolai's been arrested. The accusations are quite crazy. Trotskyism and links with the Gestapo." "How appalling," said Lyudmila, thinking to herself. What if Tolya's unit had got surrounded? Then he'd have had the same accusations levelled against him. "Vitya will take this very badly," she said. "He's incredibly nervous at present. He thinks he's about to be arrested. He keeps going back over everything he's ever said, who he said it to and when, especially during that unfortunate time in Kazan." Yevgenia stared at her sister for a while. Finally she said, "Shall I tell you the most terrible thing of all? This investigator said to me, 'How can you claim to be ignorant of your husband's Trotskyism when he himself told you Trotsky's verdict on one of his articles? Splendid, that's pure marble.' On my way home I remembered Nikolai saying to me, 'You're the only person who knows those words.' That night it suddenly hit me. I told that story to Novikov when he came to Kubyshev in the autumn. I was horrified. I thought I was going out of my mind." "You poor woman. But then that's the sort of thing that would happen to you." "What do you mean?" asked Yevgenia. "It could just as well have happened to you." "No. You left one man for another. Then you told the second man about the first. What do you expect?" "You've probably done the same. You left Tolya's father. I'm sure you've talked about him to Viktor Pavlovich." "You're wrong," said Lyudmila emphatically. "Anyway, that's different." "Why is it different?" asked Yevgenia, feeling suddenly irritated. "What you're saying now is just plain stupid." "Oh, maybe it is," answered Lyudmila calmly. "Have you got the time?" asked Yevgenia. "I've got to go to 24 Kuznetsky Most." Giving vent to her anger, she went on, "You've got a difficult character, Lyuda. I can understand why Mama lives in like a gypsy in Kazan instead of staying with you in your 4-room flat." Yevgenia immediately regretted these harsh words. Wanting Lyudmila to understand that the trust between them was stronger than any chance misunderstanding, she said, "I do want to trust Novikov, but still, who else could have told the security organs? It's terrible. It's like being lost in a fog." Yevgenia would have given so much to have her mother beside her. She would have leant her head on her shoulder and said, "Dearest, I'm so tired." "You know what might have happened," said Lyudmila. "Your general might have mentioned this conversation to someone else, who then reported it." "Yes," said Yevgenia, "of course. How strange, I never thought of something as simple as that." In the quiet calm of Lyudmila's home, Yevgenia felt even more conscious of the confusion inside her, the thoughts and feelings she had repressed, the secret pain and anxiety from the time she and Krimov had separated, the tenderness she still felt for him, the way she still felt somehow accustomed to him. Everything had flared up with renewed intensity during these last weeks. She thought of Krimov when she was at work, when she was in a tram, when she was queuing for food. She dreamt of him almost every night, moaning, crying out in her sleep, waking up repeatedly. She had terrible nightmares, full of fires and scenes of war. There was always some danger threatening Nikolai Grigorovich, and she was always powerless to protect him. And when she got washed and dressed in the morning, afraid of being late for work, she'd still be thinking of him. She didn't think she loved him. But is it possible to think so incessantly of someone you don't love? And if she didn't love him, how could she feel such distress over the tragedy that had overtaken him? And why, when Limonov and Shagorodsky made fun of the supposed non-entities who were his favourite artists and poets, did she always want to see Nikolai, to run her fingers through his hair, to comfort and fondle him? She no longer remembered his fanaticism, his lack of concern over people who had been arrested, the anger and hatred in his voice when he talked about kulaks. Now she only remembered his good side. She only remembered what was sad, touching and romantic about him. It was his weakness that gave him power over her. There had always been something helpless in the way he smiled. His movements were awkward, and his eyes were those of a child. She saw him sitting there with his shoulder tabs torn off and his face covered in grey stubble. She saw him lying on a plank bed at night. She saw his back as he walked up and down the prison yard. He must be thinking she had had a premonition of his fate, and that was why she had left him. And all night he was thinking about her. Madam General. She had no idea whether these thoughts sprang from love, pity, a guilty conscience, or a sense of duty. Novikov had sent her a pass, and arranged by radio for a pilot he knew to take her by Douglas to Front HQ. Her superiors had given her 3 weeks' leave to visit him. She tried to reassure herself, telling herself over and over again, "He'll understand, he's sure to understand. There just wasn't anything else I could do." She knew very well how badly she'd behaved towards Novikov. There he was, still waiting for her. She'd written him a mercilessly truthful letter. After sending it off, she had realised that the letter would be read by the military censors. All this could make terrible problems for him. "Oh, no, he'll understand," she repeated to herself. Yes, of course, he would understand. And leave her forever. Did she really love him? Or was it just his love for her that she loved? When she thought about the terrible break with him, she was overwhelmed by fear, melancholy, and a sense of horror at the thought of being left on her own. It was unbearable to think that she had destroyed her happiness with her own hands. It was equally unbearable, on the other hand, to think that there was nothing she could do about it, that it was now up to Novikov whether or not they finally separated. When the thought of Novikov became unbearable, she tried to imagine Nikolai Grigorovich. Perhaps she'd be summoned for a confrontation. "Hello, my poor darling." Well, Novikov was tall, strong, broad-shouldered, and in a position of power. He didn't need her support. He could take care of himself. She thought of him sometimes as her knight in armour. She'd never forget his handsome, charming face. She'd always grieve for him, always grieve for the happiness she had destroyed. But what of it? She wasn't sorry for herself. She wasn't afraid of suffering. But then she knew that Novikov wasn't really so very strong. Sometimes she'd glimpsed a timid, almost helpless look on his face. Nor was she really so pitiless towards herself, so indifferent to her own sufferings. As though she had just read her sister's thoughts, Lyudmila asked, "So, what's going to happen about this general of yours?" "I can't bear to think." "What you need is a good hiding." "There just wasn't anything else I could do," pleaded Yevgenia. "I don't like your continual wavering. If you leave someone, you should make a clean break of it." "Oh, yes," said Yevgenia. "Take good care of yourself and keep out of trouble. I'm afraid I can't live like that." "That's not what I mean. I don't like Krimov, but I respect him, and I haven't even set eyes on your general. But now you've decided to be his wife, you do have a certain responsibility towards him, and you're not behaving responsibly at all. An important officer with a wife sending parcels to someone in camp. You know how that could end." "I do." "Do you love him or not?" "Leave me alone," said Evgenia, sounding as though she were about to cry. At the same time she asked herself, "But which of them do I love?" "No, I want you to answer." "There was nothing else I could do. People don't cross the threshold of the Lubyanka just for the fun of it." You shouldn't think only of yourself. I'm not thinking only of myself. Victor agrees with me. Really, it's just pure egotism. You do have the most extraordinary sense of logic. It's amazed me ever since I was a child. Is this what you call egotism? But what can you do to help? You can't change his sentence. If you ever get arrested, then you'll learn what someone who loves you can do to help. To change the subject, Ludmilla asked, "Have you got any photographs of Marusia?" "Just one. Do you remember? It was taken when we were in Sokolniki." Yevgenia put her head on Ludmilla's shoulder. "I'm so tired," she said plaintively. "Go and lie down for a while. You need a rest. You shouldn't go anywhere today. I've made up the bed." Yevgenia shook her head. Her eyes were still half closed. No, there's no point. I'm just tired of living." Ludmilla went to fetch a large envelope and emptied a heap of photographs onto her sister's lap. Yevgenia went through them, exclaiming, "Oh, my God, my God! Oh, yes, I remember that. It was when we were at the dacha. How funny little Nadia looks. That was after Papa had come back from exile. And there's Dmitri as a schoolboy. Seryota looks so like him, especially the upper part of his face. And there's Mamma with Marusia in her arms. That was before I was even born." She noticed that there weren't any photographs of Tolya, but didn't say anything. "Well, madam," said Ludmilla, "I must give you something to eat." "Yes, I've got a good appetite. Nothing affects that. It was the same when I was a child." "I'm glad to hear it," said Ludmilla, giving her sister a kiss. Yevgenia got off the trolley bus by the Bolshoi Theatre, now covered in camouflage, and walked up Kuznetsky Most. Without even noticing them, she went past the exhibition rooms of the Artists' Foundation. Friends of hers had exhibited there before the war, and her own paintings had once been shown there. It was very strange. Her life was like a pack of cards shuffled by a gypsy. Now she had drawn Moscow. She was still a long way away when she recognized the towering granite wall of the Lubyanka. "Hello, Kolya," she thought. Perhaps Nikolai Grigorovich would sense her presence. Without knowing why, he would feel disturbed and excited. Her old fate was now her new fate. What had seemed lost forever had become her future. The spacious new reception room, whose polished windows looked out onto the street, had been closed. Visitors now had to go to the old room. She walked into a dirty courtyard, past a dilapidated wall, and came to a half-open door. Everything inside looked surprisingly normal. Tables covered in ink stains, wooden benches along the walls, little information windows with wooden sills. There seemed to be no connection between this ordinary waiting room and the vast, many-storied stone building that looked out over Lubyanka Square, Stretenka, Furkasovsky Lane, and Malaya Lubyanka Street. There were lots of people there. The visitors, mostly women, were standing in line in front of the windows. A few were sitting on the benches, and there was one old man wearing glasses with thick lenses who was filling in a form at a table. Looking at those faces, young and old, male and female, Yevgenia noticed that the expression in their eyes and the set of their mouths all spoke of one thing. If she had met any of these people in the street or in a tram, she could have guessed that they frequented 24 Kuznetsky Most. She turned to the young man by the door. He was dressed in an army greatcoat, but for some reason he looked very unlike a soldier. "Your first time?" he asked, and pointed to one of the windows. Yevgenia took her place in the queue, passport in hand, her fingers and palms damp with sweat. A woman in a beret who was standing in front of her said quietly, "If he's not here in the inner prison, you must go to Mastrovskaya Tishina and then to Butyrka. But that's only open on certain days, and they see people in alphabetical order. If he's not there, you must go to the Lefortovo military prison, and then back here again. I've been looking for my son for 6 weeks now. Have you been to the military prosecutor yet?" The queue was moving very quickly. That seemed a bad sign. The answers people were getting must be vague and laconic. Then it was the turn of a smart, middle-aged woman, and there was a delay. The word went round that the man on duty had gone to check something in person. A mere telephone call hadn't been enough. The woman had turned round and was half facing the queue. Her slightly narrowed eyes seemed to be saying that she had no intention of letting herself be treated in the same manner as this miserable crowd of relatives of the repressed. Soon the queue began to move again. A young woman who had just left the window said quietly, "Everyone's getting the same answer. Parcel not accepted." "Oh, that means the investigation's still not completed," explained the woman in front of Yevgenia. "What about visits?" "Visits?" The woman smiled at Yevgenia's naivety. Yevgenia had never realized that the human back could be so expressive, could so vividly reflect a person's state of mind. People had a particular way of craning their necks as they came up to the window. Their backs, with their head raised, tense shoulders, seemed to be crying, to be sobbing and screaming. When Yevgenia was seventh in the queue, the window slammed shut, and a 20-minute break was announced. Everyone sat down on the chairs and benches. There were wives and mothers. There was a middle-aged engineer whose wife, an interpreter in the All-Union Society for Cultural Relations, had been arrested. There was a girl in her last year at school whose mother had been arrested and whose father had been sentenced in 1937 to 10 years without right of correspondence. There was an old blind woman who had been brought here by a neighbour to inquire after her son. There was a foreigner, the wife of a German communist, who spoke very poor Russian. She wore a foreign-looking checked coat and carried a brightly coloured cloth handbag, but her eyes were the eyes of an old Russian woman. There were Russian women, Armenian women, Ukrainian women and Jewish women. There was a woman who worked for a kolkhoz near Moscow. The old man who'd been filling in the form turned out to be a lecturer at the Timiri Azev Academy. His grandson, a schoolboy, had been arrested, apparently for talking too much at a party. Yevgenia learnt a great deal during those 20 minutes. The man on duty today was one of the good ones. They don't accept tinned food in the butyrka. You really must bring onion and garlic. They're good for scurvy. There was a man here last Wednesday who'd come to pick up his documents. He'd been 3 years in the butyrka without once being interrogated and had then been released. Usually people are sent to a camp before about a year after they've been arrested. You mustn't bring anything too good. At the transit prison in Presnaya, the politicals are put together with the common criminals and everything gets stolen. There was a woman here the other day whose elderly husband, an important engineer and designer, had been arrested. Apparently he had had a brief affair in his youth and gone on sending the woman alimony for a son he had never set eyes on. The son, now adult, had deserted to the Germans, and the old man had got 10 years for fathering a traitor to the motherland. Most people were sentenced under Article 58.10, counter-revolutionary agitation, or not keeping their mouths shut. There had been arrests just before the 1st of May. There are always a lot just before public holidays. There was one woman who had been phoned at home by the investigator and had suddenly heard her husband's voice. How strange it all was. Here in the waiting room of the NKVD, Yevgenia somehow felt calmer, less depressed than after her bath at Lyudmila's house. What wonderful good fortune to have a parcel accepted! One of the people near her said in a stifled whisper, "When it comes to people who were arrested in 1937, they just say whatever comes into their head. One woman was told he's alive and working. She came back a second time, and the same person gave her a certificate saying her husband had died in 1939. Now it was Yevgenia's turn. The man behind the window looked up at her. His face was like that of any other clerk. Yesterday he might have been working on the desk at a fire station, and tomorrow, if he was ordered to, he might be filling in forms for military decorations. "I want to inquire about someone who's been arrested. Krimov, Nikolai Grigorovich," said Yevgenia. She had the feeling that even people who didn't know her would be able to tell that she wasn't speaking in her normal voice. "When was he arrested?" "November." The man took out a form. "Fill this in." You don't need to queue again, just hand it straight in and come back tomorrow for the answer. As he handed her the form, the man looked at her again. This time his rapid glance was not that of an ordinary clerk at all. It was the glance of a checist, an intelligent glance that remembers everything. She filled in the form with trembling fingers, just like the old man from the Timiriazev Academy, who not long before had been sitting on the same chair. When she came to the question about her relationship to the person arrested, she wrote wife, underlining the word heavily. She handed the form in, sat down on the bench, and put her passport back in her bag. She kept moving it from one part of the bag to another. Finally, she realised this was because she didn't want to leave the people in the queue. At that moment she wanted only one thing, to let Krimov know that she was here, that she'd given up everything for him, and that she had come to him. Only if he could find out that she was here, so near him, if only. She walked down the street. It was already evening. Most of her life had been spent in this city, but that life, with its theatres, art exhibitions, orchestral concerts, dinners in restaurants, visits to dachas, was now so distant as to be no longer her own. Stalingrad and Kuibyshev had disappeared, as had the handsome, sometimes divinely handsome face of Novikov himself. All that was left was 24 Kuznetsky Most. It was as though she was walking down the unfamiliar streets of a city she had never seen before.